Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive deep into Taoism.
Always ready for a deep dive.
This time we're tackling the Tao.
Ah, the Tao.
And it's trickier than it seems at first glance.
You could say that again.
We've got all sorts of sources, scholarly stuff, translations of the LaoZi, of course, even some classic Chinese commentaries.
It's going to be a good one.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
People talk about the Tao like it's a simple answer to life, like almost a magic spell.
Right, a quick fix.
Yeah, and here's the thing, when you actually read the source material, it's anything but simple.
Oh, absolutely. The LaoZi itself uses Tao in so many ways. It can be a cosmic force, like shaping the universe.
Uh-huh.
But then it's a natural principle, like how things just work.
I say.
And then suddenly it's advice, like how you should live your life. It's wild.
It really is. It's like the text is playing with us, like daring us to define it.
Maybe it doesn't want to be defined.
That's a good point. Maybe that's part of the whole thing, this ever-shifting, impossible to categorize idea.
That fluidity is key. The whole text is full of these contradictions.
Right.
Oh, yeah, paradoxes everywhere, and it seems to like that.
Okay, give me an example. Like, how does that play out in the LaoZi?
So there's this concept of returning.
Returning?
Yeah, it sounds simple, but it's all about how opposites interact.
Opposites.
Things move in opposite directions, but ultimately they come back to a balance.
That's a cycle, expansion and contraction, creation, destruction, all that.
Exactly. And it's like that in nature all the time, like day and night, the cycle of that. Or how about water flowing downhill? Goes to the sea, right?
Sure.
But then it evaporates, comes back as rain, returns to the mountains. It's beautiful.
So returning isn't just like coming back to the same spot. It's more about, I don't know, recognizing that opposites are like connected.
Exactly. They're two sides of the same coin. And the LaoZi goes even further, saying that this returning is the essence of the Tao. It's what keeps the whole universe in balance.
Wow, that's deep.
It is. It makes you think about how this applies to our own lives, doesn't it?
Yeah, like how can we even see these opposites at work in our own experiences?
That's the question. And I think the LaoZi wants us to think about that. It's not just a philosophical idea. It's about how we live, how we decide things, how we interact with, well, everything.
So we've got this Tao. It's dynamic. It's all about balance, opposites being connected. But what do you do with that?
Well, that's where non-action comes in, or wu-wei.
Ah, wu-wei. That's always a tough one.
It is. It's easily misinterpreted.
I mean, doesn't it sound kind of passive? Like just letting life happen to you?
That's the common misconception. It's not about being inactive. It's more like aligning yourself with how the Tao flows.
Yeah.
Avoiding, unnecessary force or pushing.
So instead of swimming upstream, you're going with the current.
Precisely. You got to understand the natural rhythms and work with them, not against them.
So wu-wei isn't laziness. It's more like strategic action, I guess.
It's about understanding the natural way things unfold and acting accordingly. It can be tough to grasp, especially in a culture where we're always pushing for more.
It's starting to sound pretty mystical, Like, are we talking visions and altered states and all that?
It does have a mystical element to it, but not in the way you might think.
So how does the LaoZi approach mysticism, then?
It uses this thing called apophatic language.
Apophatic language?
Yeah, it's basically describing the Tao by saying what it isn't rather than what it is.
Okay. Like how?
You'll find lines like, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao.
Oh, I've heard that one before.
Right, or the Tao is nameless, formless beyond comprehension. Stuff like that.
So it's like the text is saying, look, I can try to describe this thing, but you got to experience it yourself to really get it.
Exactly. It's pointing us beyond just intellectual concepts. It wants us to engage with the Tao on a deeper, more experiential level. And that's where the practical side of Taoism comes in.
Right. That's where all the practices come in, like trying to actually embody the Tao.
Exactly. And those practices, they're called Yangsheng.
Yangsheng. Okay.
They're all about cultivating longevity, vitality, being more spiritually aware, all through different methods.
I guess that makes sense, given how much the LaoZi talks about babies and their potential. Like, there's this respect for the body's natural power.
Absolutely. And you see that reflected in other texts, too, like the Naye, the Zhuangzi, the Baopuzi.
Wow, so many texts.
They all offer these insights into early Taoist practices, how to cultivate your body and spirit. Real practical advice, too, on everything from diet and breathing to, meditation visualizations, all aimed at aligning yourself with the Tao.
So it's not just about reading and thinking about the LaoZi, it's about actually doing something with it.
Exactly. That's where things get really interesting. But before we go there, there's this one passage in the LaoZi that I got to ask you about.
Oh, which one?
The one about straw dogs. It
Yeah.
always gets me thinking.
Ah, yes, the straw dogs. That's a head-scratcher. It says, heaven and earth treat everything like straw dogs. What does that even mean?
To understand that, we need to go back in time, back to ancient China. They used actual straw dogs in ceremonies back then?
Really?
Yeah, they were important for the ritual, but afterwards they just tossed them aside.
So, important for a while, but ultimately disposable.
Exactly. And that's the point the LaoZi is trying to make. It's highlighting how impartial the Tao is.
Impartial.
It doesn't have favorites. It treats everything the same, the biggest stars, the smallest bugs, all the same to the Tao.
That's a tough one to wrap your head around. I mean, we humans are always valuing some things more than others.
It definitely challenges our usual way of thinking. It's
Yeah.
suggesting there's a bigger picture, a cosmic order beyond our human judgments.
That is deep. And it makes me wonder, if the Tao is so impartial, then what about morality? Like, is there even room for compassion and ethics and all that?
That's the key question. And to answer that, we need to look at how the LaoZi portrays the sage.
The sage.
The one who embodies the Tao, who lives in perfect harmony with it.
Right, the sage. But before we get into that, I'm curious, what about the relationship between Taoism and Confucianism?
Ah, good point.
They're always presented as opposites, but our sources seem to say it's more complicated than that.
Oh, it definitely is. That Taoism versus Confucianism thing is way too simplistic.
So it's not like you have to choose one or the other.
No, not at all. They both have unique perspectives, but there's overlap too, especially when it comes to, how to live a good life, how to be virtuous, that kind of thing.
So maybe they both offer valuable insights.
Absolutely. Both traditions are trying to answer the same big questions: how to live well, how to create a just society, how we relate to everything around us. It's fascinating how they approach these questions differently, but in a way, they complete each other. And that's where the commentaries come in. They show us how different thinkers over time have interpreted the LaoZi.
Like different perspectives on the same text.
Exactly. You have Wang Bi, Hashangong, Shanger, all these different figures from different eras, each with their own take on the LaoZi.
It's like this ongoing conversation, centuries long.
It is. And it reminds us that there's not just one way to understand the LaoZi. Interpretation is an ongoing process.
Which brings us to probably the biggest challenge of all, translation.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, these ancient Chinese texts, especially the LaoZi, they're so full of wordplay and hidden meanings. How do you even begin to translate that?
It's tough, that's for sure. Even something as seemingly simple as straw dogs can have multiple interpretations depending on the translator.
Oh, I see. So every translation is kind of an interpretation itself.
Exactly. The translator's own understanding, their background, it all shapes how they translate the text.
So what's the best way to approach these texts, knowing that there's no one right answer?
Be curious. Explore different translations, compare them, see how different scholars have understood the same passages. And don't be afraid of the footnotes, the commentaries, the alternative readings.
So kind of like what we're doing right now.
Exactly. We're taking a deep dive, looking at things from different angles, trying to piece together a deeper understanding of this whole Dao thing. And don't shy away from the ambiguity. The LaoZi doesn't give you easy answers. It wants you to question, to think, to join this conversation that's been going on for thousands of years.
That's a good way to put it. It's not about finding the right answer, but about the process of figuring things out. And that can be pretty rewarding, even if you end up with more questions than you started with.
Absolutely. The LaoZi makes you think differently, challenges you to expand how you see the world and your place in it.
Yeah.
It still resonates with people today because it speaks to something universal about being human.
Yeah, I get that. Our search for meaning, our desire for harmony, that struggle to just navigate life. And speaking of navigating, the LaoZi's emphasis on returning, on things being cyclical.
Yeah.
It's kind of comforting, like even amidst all the chaos, there's this underlying order, a balance that always comes back around.
It's a beautiful thing. The LaoZi gives us a perspective that goes beyond our everyday struggles. It helps us connect to something bigger, something that endures.
Which leads to a big question.
Yeah.
What does all this ancient wisdom have to offer us today? I mean, can these Taoist principles actually help us navigate the 21st century?
That's something for each of us to ponder. But think about it. In a world that feels so frantic and disconnected, the LaoZi tells us to slow down, to observe, to align ourselves with the natural rhythms of life.
It's almost like a countercultural message, isn't it?
In a way, it is. The LaoZi reminds us that true power doesn't come from dominating others, but from finding harmony.
So maybe it's not about escaping the world, but about engaging with it in a more mindful way.
That's it. It's about finding a way to live in accordance with the Tao, not just off on a mountaintop somewhere, but in our everyday lives, in our relationships, our jobs, our communities.
Which, when you think about it, is a pretty radical idea.
It is. It's not about following some external authority or forcing our will on the world. It's about cultivating inner harmony that naturally flows outwards, influencing the world simply by being who we are.
That's the true power of the Tao, huh?
It is, and it's a power available to all of us. Not through force or control, but through understanding, alignment, and that subtle but profound influence of Tao.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. But before we move on, one more thing. Our sources mention learning from the present. What's that got to do with the Tao?
That's crucial. The LaoZi draws wisdom from ancient sources, sure, but it also emphasizes adapting to life's changes.
So it's not about getting stuck in the past.
No, it's about being present, responsive to what's happening now.
Because the Tao isn't some fixed set of rules.
Right. It's a living principle, and it manifests differently in each moment. To truly embody it, you have to be aware of the present, letting your actions flow naturally from that understanding.
Which ties back into Wu-Wei, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Acting in alignment with the natural flow.
It's all connected, and that interconnectedness is one of the most profound insights the LaoZi offers.
We're not isolated individuals. We're part of a larger web, a cosmic dance of energy and change.
Beautifully put. And within that dance, there's this constant interplay of opposites, like we were talking about earlier, returning and opposing, action and non-action.
Yin and Yang.
Exactly. And the LaoZi challenges us to embrace those paradoxes, to see them not as contradictions, but as complementary parts of a single dynamic reality.
This has been an incredible deep dive already. We've only scratched the surface, but even these glimpses have been so insightful.
They really have. Our sources have given us a lot to think about.
So where do we go from here?
Well, we've explored the interpretations, the commentaries, the challenges of translation. Now it's up to each of us to take these insights and integrate them into our own understanding.
The journey continues.
It does. We've laid the groundwork, but the real work begins when we step outside the text and start applying these principles to our own lives.
That's a great point. It's one thing to grasp the Tao intellectually, but it's another to actually live it.
And that's where things get truly transformative. The LaoZi shows us the way, but we have to walk the path ourselves. We have to cultivate balance, harmony, that effortless action in our own way.
Okay, so much to think about already. We were talking about actually living in accordance with the Tao.
Right, putting these ideas into practice.
And you mentioned the sage, how they kind of embody the Tao.
Yeah.
But how does that work if the Tao is impartial, like we were talking about with the straw dogs?
It's a good question. Think of it like this. The Tao is like a vast ocean, all these currents and tides.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
And the sage is a skilled sailor, someone who knows how to navigate those waters to work with the ocean, not against it.
So the sage isn't trying to control everything. They're more like...
A guide, yeah, an inspiration. They embody the Tao, showing others how to live in harmony with it.
But how do they actually do that? I mean, if the Tao treats everything equally, doesn't the sage just kind of stand back and let things happen?
That's where day comes into play, remember. It's often translated as virtue or power, but it's not about force.
Right, it's not about dominating others. It's more like...
A magnetic force, maybe? Something that attracts and influences, but without coercion.
That's a good way to put it. So the sage's day is basically the Tao expressing itself through them.
Exactly. It's an effortless influence, a natural flow that comes from aligning with the Tao.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But can you give me a concrete example from the LaoZi? Like, what does this actually look like?
Well, there's that line that says, the sage empties minds and fills bellies.
Empties minds, fills bellies.
Yeah.
That's a bit cryptic.
It is, but it's packed with meaning. By emptying minds, it's talking about helping people let go of their ego, their attachments, all the stuff that clouds their perception.
So clearing away the mental clutter.
Exactly. And by filling bellies, it means attending to people's basic needs, creating a foundation for well-being and contentment.
It's like creating the conditions for people to thrive naturally, rather than trying to impose solutions.
Exactly. And this is where those Yangsheng practices come in.
Oh, right. The practices for cultivating longevity and embodying the Tao.
A lot of those practices are about finding inner harmony and balance. Meditation, breath work, mindful movement, all those things help you align with the Tao on a personal level.
So it's almost like becoming your own mini sage. in a way.
You could say that. It's about cultivating your own Tao and letting it flow outwards, influencing the world around you.
I'm starting to see how powerful this can be, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
And that's something that commentators on the LaoZi have debated for centuries.
Mhm.
There are so many different interpretations on how these principles apply in different contexts.
Like, what did they say about the role of the sage in government? Because the LaoZi doesn't seem to be promoting a typical top-down leadership style.
That's one of the big questions, yeah. Some commentators, like Wang Bi, focused on the ruler cultivating their own Tao and governing through non-action, basically creating the space for the people to flourish naturally.
So less about controlling and more about cultivating.
Exactly. Others, like He Gong, took a more practical approach, offering advice on how to apply Taoist principles to things like economics and diplomacy, even military strategy.
It's amazing how these ancient texts can still speak to us today, even in such different circumstances.
And that's what makes the Laozi so compelling. But we have to acknowledge one more layer of complexity: translation.
Right, we were talking about how each translation is an interpretation, influenced by the translator's choices and background.
And with a text as nuanced as the Laozi, those choices can really change the meaning we get from it.
So how do we even know if we're getting a reliable translation? Are there any guidelines?
There's no easy answer, unfortunately. The best approach is to explore multiple translations, compare them, see how different scholars have approached the same passages. Pay close attention to footnotes, commentaries, all the different readings.
So it's like a detective game almost.
It is, and it's an ongoing process. That's the beauty of the Laozi. It invites us to keep questioning, keep exploring, keep deepening our understanding.
And that's where the real work begins, right?
Mhm.
Taking these ideas and actually putting them into practice in our own lives.
Absolutely. Because understanding the Tao intellectually is one thing, but embodying it, living it, that's a whole other level.
The LaoZi gives us a map, but we have to walk the path ourselves.
Well said. It's a path of self-cultivation, of aligning with the natural order, of finding harmony within ourselves and with the world around us.
You know, through all these discussions, one thing keeps popping up for me. This idea of balance. It seems like the LaoZi is obsessed with it.
It really is a recurring theme. And you know what? It connects to almost everything we've been talking about. Returning, Wu Wei, the sage's influence, even those straw dogs we were puzzling over.
That's right. It all ties back to this idea of cosmic harmony. Like everything has its place and its role to play in that.
Exactly. And that includes all those things we usually see as opposites. Remember how the LaoZi keeps talking about yin and yang, action and non-action, strength and softness?
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance point, that sweet spot where those apparent opposites actually work together.
It's a pretty radical idea when you think about it. I mean, especially in our world today, where it feels like everything's about competition, about one side winning and the other losing.
It is, and it creates a lot of imbalance, not just out there in the world, but inside us too.
So how do we apply this idea of balance to our own lives? Does the LaoZi give us any, practical advice on that?
It does, and a lot of it comes back to Wu Wei, that effortless action that comes from understanding how things naturally work.
So it's not just about knowing the Tao, but about actually aligning ourselves with it.
Precisely, and that takes practice. We have to cultivate this deep awareness of ourselves, of our environment, of all the ways things are interconnected.
Sounds like a lifelong project.
Yeah.
But where do we even start?
Honestly, the LaoZi is a great place to begin. It lays out these principles, encourages us to think about them, wrestle with them, and ultimately find our own ways to apply them.
And also all those Yangsheng practices, right? All those techniques for cultivating longevity and embodying the Tao.
Absolutely. And a lot of those practices, things like meditation, breath work, mindful movement, they all help us develop that inner stillness and awareness that's crucial for staying balanced when life gets chaotic.
So it's not just a matter of reading the LaoZi, it's about putting those ideas into action.
Exactly. It's about embodying those principles. That's where the real transformation happens. The LaoZi points the way, but it's up to each of us to walk that path, to find our own way to express that balance, that harmony, that effortless action.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've explored so much, the philosophy, the paradoxes, the way it all applies to our lives today.
And it's just the beginning, really.
I hope it's inspired everyone listening to keep exploring these ideas. The LaoZi is a text that keeps on giving. The more you read it, the more you reflect on it, the more you discover.
It really is a wellspring of wisdom.
And as we all continue our own deep dives into the Tao, remember to embrace the challenges, the uncertainty, the paradoxes. Because often, That's where the real insights are hiding.
Well said. To all our fellow deep divers out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, keep engaging with the LaoZi. Its wisdom is there for those who seek it.
And remember, the journey is the destination. May your paths be filled with insight, harmony, and that effortless flow of Wu Wei.